The day Leland Holloway's brother arrived at the farmhouse door, he did not shout or threaten. He simply handed Russell the folded county notice, waited while she read it, and said he was sorry for her loss in the same flat tone a man uses when he means he is sorry for the inconvenience of it. The notice said what she had already suspected from the creditor's letters that had been arriving since September, addressed to the estate of Leland Holloway, as though Leland were a property himself rather than a man who had borrowed against one. The farmstead, the house, the hayshed, the far 40 where the soil ran good and dark, all of it had been pledged against debts she had not known the full measure of while he was alive. His brother was not a cruel man exactly. He was the kind of man who inherited the habit of taking and called it settling accounts. Russell packed what was hers in a flour sack and a small wooden crate. The mule, her mother's notebook, which she had carried in the bottom of her traveling chest since Cora Dean had died in the spring of 1884, 3 years before any of this. And Hob, the old brindle hound who had been Leland's dog by registry but Russell's by long practice, who sat beside her feet on the road, as though he had always known which one of them he was waiting for. She did not cry on the road. She was 34 years old, and she had learned watching her mother that grief spent on the road was grief that could not be spent later on something useful. If you are watching this and you have ever been told, in one form or another, that you do not belong where you have built your life, stay with this story. It is worth the telling. There is something in it that belongs to you. That is the shape of how Russell Holloway arrived in the autumn of 1887, with almost nothing at all, and went on to build something that outlasted every man who had laughed at it. She was not a woman given to waiting for rescuing. That much had been settled in her some years before, in the river-cut hills of Missouri, where she had grown up watching her mother Cora work. Cora Dean had been a woman who understood what the land offered if you were patient and specific with it, and what it refused if you were careless. She had plastered the interior walls of their house herself, not with lime bought at the store, but with river clay dug from the bank 200 yards downstream, worked with a little sand and water and laid in coats, 2 inches minimum, 3 inches where the wall met the ground. She had told Russell that clay breathed differently than wood, that it held what you gave it and let it go slowly, the way a good neighbor remembers a kindness longer than it is owed. Russell had helped her do it at the age of 9, 10, 11, her small hands following the motion of her mother's broader ones along the surface, pressing, smoothing, listening to the sound the clay made when it had seated itself correctly against the wall, a low, flat sound like a hand laid firmly on a table. Cora had explained as she worked. Clay dries slow and binds slow, she said. And that is exactly its virtue. Quick things do not hold. Clay will give you back every hour you put into it and charge you nothing for the keeping. When Cora died, she left Russell nothing in money because there was none. What she left was the notebook, a sheaf of pages sewn into a cloth cover, filled in her small, careful hand with notes on soils, wall preparation, the ratios she had worked out for mixing clay with sand in different conditions, observations on which river bends yielded the reddest clay and which the most plastic. It was not a book anyone in Heron Flat, Nebraska would have recognized as an inheritance. It was more valuable than the farmstead had been. Russell knew that. She had known it the morning she packed the crate. Heron Flat in the autumn of 1887 was a town that had not yet decided what it was going to be. It sat in a long crease of the plains, where a creek had cut south before turning east, and the soil on either side of the creek was the kind of dark, settled earth that meant the place had been choosing its own future for a long time, before any homesteaders arrived to think they were choosing it for it. There were perhaps 60 families within a reasonable distance of the town center, a dry goods store owned by Ambrose Ketterly, a one-room schoolhouse, a church with a fresh coat of whitewash that had not yet weathered, and the particular atmosphere of a settlement that has just enough confidence in itself to be impatient with anything unfamiliar. Russell filed a claim on a creek-cut bank 3 miles south of town and began digging her dugout in the first week of October. The bank gave her 3 good walls already, the earth itself doing what an expensive frame and boards would have done elsewhere. And she set her excavation back into the hill at a depth and width her mother's notes suggested for a single person dwelling in a cold climate. She had read those notes many times. She knew what they said without always opening the book. The opening was a ritual as much as a reference. The mule helped with the heavier hauling. Hobbs supervised from a low rise nearby, his ears forward, watching the creek. She had been at the clay work for 3 days before anyone from town noticed. The creek bank downstream offered good material, a reddish clay with the plasticity her mother had described, the kind that compressed between 2 fingers into a ribbon rather than crumbling. Russell tested it the way Cora had shown her, pressing a ball of it in her palm, working it until the surface grew smooth and faintly waxy. Then she began hauling it in buckets on the mule's back, 2 trips a morning and 2 in the afternoon, and carrying it inside the dugout's half-finished walls, where she worked it into the earthen surface in long horizontal strokes, pressing the clay firm against the soil with the heel of her hand, and then, with a flat board she had shaped for the purpose. The thickness on the open walls was 2 inches, built up in 3 separate coats with drying time between. Where the wall met the floor, she pressed it to 3 inches, just as the notebook said, because the cold traveled differently at the base of a wall than it did across its face, working up from the ground rather than through the air. And that last inch of extra clay at the joint was the difference between a floor that stayed merely cool and one that held a chill that would defeat any small fire you kept. She knew this. She worked steadily and without hurrying, and Hob curled near the entrance in the afternoons and watched the light change on the creek. And sometimes in the evenings Russell sat inside the half-finished dugout and held her hand to the clay surface and felt that it had already begun its slow work of holding what she had given it. The first time anyone spoke about it in town was early November, in the way things were spoken about in Heron Flat, which was from the porch of Ketterly's Dry Goods, on a morning when Russell happened to be walking toward the store for salt and lamp oil. There were 3 men on the porch that morning: Ambrose Ketterly himself, a pale, wide-shouldered man with a merchant's habit of speaking in a carrying voice, whether indoors or out; a farmer named Gus Pell who leaned against the post and mostly listened, and a younger man whose name Russell did not know then, though she learned it later. She had come perhaps 20 yards from the porch when she heard Ketterly say to the others, without lowering his tone even slightly, that the Holloway widow had taken up residence in a mud burrow 3 miles south and was spending her days packing the walls with creek bottom. He said it the way a man says something he has already decided is amusing, waiting for the others to confirm the judgment. Gus Pell said he had heard the same. Ketterly said, and she could hear the particular satisfaction in it, that he supposed some women grief-turned went one way and some went another, and the ones who went to the creek with buckets were the ones who needed the kind of help the county could not exactly provide. Russell went inside and bought her salt and her lamp oil and said nothing. She said nothing on the road back. She said nothing that evening or the next morning. She pressed another coat of clay along the west wall and let it set overnight. By the 3rd week of November, the phrase had fixed itself. The Mud Woman's Burrow, that was what it was called, and not quietly. It appeared to please Ketterly especially, who had a gift for the kind of casual contempt that a community adopts without examination, because it comes preformed from someone with standing. 2 or 3 women of the church-going circle had begun to speak of Russell with that particular mixture of concern and distance that people use when they want to keep a thing at arm's length without admitting they are afraid of it. One of them, whose name was Martha Greer, told Nell Sutter directly that she thought Russell Holloway had been undone by the combination of her husband's debts and her grief, and that someone ought to speak to her, meaning someone ought to speak to her about stopping. Nell Sutter listened to all of this without agreeing to any of it. Nell was a widow herself, 2 years into managing her place and her 2 children alone, after her husband had gone of a fever in the summer of 1885, and she had a quiet-sided practical intelligence that the church circle sometimes mistook for reserve. She had heard about the clay lining from the same source as everyone else, and she had thought about it differently than everyone else, which is to say she had not thought it needed explaining away. She had driven past the creek bank one October afternoon on her way south to check her fence line and had seen Russell working, seen the deliberate economy of the movements, seen the clay walls inside the dugout taking on their reddish-gray coat, and had not felt pity or amusement. She had felt something closer to recognition, the way you recognize someone doing a thing correctly even when you cannot yet explain why it is correct. She stopped her wagon on the way back and said hello to Russell across the bank. Russell looked up from the work. Nell said she supposed the clay would hold the heat better than bare dirt. Russell said her mother had found it to be so. Nell said she would come again on Thursday if the weather allowed. She came on Thursday and for 3 Thursdays after that, hauling clay in her own wagon without asking for explanation or offering to stop. The 2 women worked in a companionable quiet that neither of them felt the need to fill with conversation they did not have. Sometimes Nell's son, a boy of 10 named Cal, came with her and sat with Hob on the rise above the bank, and Hob permitted this with the grave tolerance of an old dog who has learned to accept the company of children as one of the minor taxes of a good life. December came in gently. The weather in the first 2 weeks was the kind of cold that reminds you winter is a fact, not a threat. The ground hardened at night and softened a little each afternoon, and the light fell long and pale across the dead grass, and the creek ice was only at the edges yet. Russell finished the clay lining. The interior walls of the dugout were smooth and cool to the touch, and slightly darker than the fresh earth, reddish where the clay ran thickest, settling toward gray where it had dried longest. She had hung a door she had built from boards she bought at Ketterly's store, paying for it in the careful, deliberate way of someone who will not give a man the satisfaction of being owed something. The door fit close. The ventilation hole she had cut at the high back of the dugout was exactly the size her mother's notes described for a single hearth interior in a climate of prolonged cold, enough to let the fire breathe, not so much that the wind could speak through it. She moved the small iron stove inside and set the pipe and lit the first fire on the 15th of December, and sat down on the earthen bench she had built along the east wall, and held her hands out toward the stove, and felt the room settle around her the way a room settles when it has been waiting for warmth and recognizes it arriving. Hob lay across the threshold, half in and half out, monitoring both conditions. Russell opened the notebook that evening and read the page she had read many times before, her mother's description of what clay walls do in the first week of fire. They draw the heat slowly into themselves, Cora had written, and they give it back slowly in the cold hours of the night, so that a room lined with good clay and a fire kept moderate will hold against the cold long after the wood is ash. It is the same principle as bread kept warm in cloth. The insulation is not in the cloth. It is in the time the heat has had to seat itself. Russell had applied this correctly. She knew it from the way the air felt at the far end of the room from the stove, which was warmer than the air inside the door of the old farmhouse had ever felt in December, even with a larger fire. She did not tell anyone this. There was no one to tell, except Nell, who already understood it from watching the work. In early January, the sky changed. It did this on a Monday, the 12th day of the month by Russell's reckoning, though she did not know yet what that particular Monday would be called in the years afterward. The morning was not extraordinary, which was itself the thing she noted. It was oddly mild, warmer than the preceding week, and the light had a quality she had seen described in her mother's notes as wrong-colored, a yellowish tint at the horizon that Cora had recorded in her notes as a warning her own mother had passed down from the river settlement days. The cattle were restless. Hobbs stayed close to the dugout all morning and would not go far from the entrance even when she gave him leave. By noon, the air had changed. The wind came from the northwest at a pace that meant it was not finished yet, and with it came cold. That was not the cold of December or of any January morning she had felt before. It came fast and it came total, and within an hour of its arrival the temperature had dropped far below what a person would have thought possible on a morning that had begun merely cool. By afternoon the snow was horizontal and the light had gone gray-white, and the world outside the dugout had been reduced to the sound of the wind and nothing else. There was no visible horizon. The creek, the road, the long pale line of the town 3 miles north, erased. Russell fed the stove and seated the door and listened. She did not know yet that in Heron Flat the schoolteacher had sent the children home before the worst of it reached town, and that some of them had made it and some had not, though those who had not would be found sheltered in haystacks and fence corners rather than harmed, through luck and cold-numb determination rather than any good architecture. She did not know that Gus Pell had lost 12 cattle in a single night, and that another farmer named Hester, south of the creek road, had lost everything in his barn and was counting himself fortunate to have made it back to his house with 3 fingers of his left hand frostbitten beyond use. She did not know that a man named Cord Ames, who lived in a frame house a 1/4 mile east of Ketterly's store, had gone out to his woodpile after supper on the night of the 12th and had not been found until the morning of the 13th, 15 feet from his own door, which is the way the cold of January 1888 took the people who were not where they needed to be when it arrived. What Russell knew inside the dugout was that the fire was small and steady, and the clay walls were giving back what they had been storing since December. The room held at a temperature a body could survive. Not comfortable exactly. Survivable steadily hour after hour, with the fire burning at a rate that would not consume her wood too fast to last the days she understood this would take. Hobbs slept with his back against the south wall, which was the warmest. On the morning of the second day, which was the 13th, she heard movement outside. She opened the door and found Nell Sutter on the packed snow with her 2 children, the boy, Cal, and a girl of 7 whose name was Ada, all 3 of them in coats that were not enough for what had happened to the weather. Nell's face had the look of someone who has been moving through cold long enough that the face itself has decided to go neutral and wait. She did not say much. She said her barn had failed, that a wall had gone in the night and taken the heat out of the adjacent room before she understood what had happened, and that she had put the children on the horse and come south because she knew where south led. Russell stepped back from the door, and they came in. The dugout had been built for 1 person, but it held 4 without the walls pressing. The clay had been doing its work for a month, and the stove's heat distributed itself evenly the way heat does in a room with mass behind the walls, not collecting at the ceiling and abandoning the floor the way it does in a frame room with nothing behind the plank walls but January air. Ada sat on the earthen bench, and Hob moved immediately to lie across her feet, which were cold, and she pressed her fingers into his fur without speaking. Cal sat beside his mother. Nell looked at the walls. She said quietly that it was warm. Russell said her mother had found that clay did not let the cold come through quickly. Nell said they would stay out of her way. Russell said there was no way to be out of. They stayed 11 days. The wood lasted because the clay walls did the work that extra wood would have done in a lesser room. Russell rationed the store carefully, laying splits in a measured pattern she had learned from watching her mother keep a river settlement house through Missouri winters. Never more than the fire needs, never less than it requires to do its work without being pushed. She cooked beans and cornmeal on the stovetop, and they ate from 2 tin cups and a tin plate that was the plate's second use each meal. Ada stopped being cold after the first afternoon and began to talk, the way children do when warmth returns to them, in a low, cheerful stream that filled the corners of the dugout with something that was not cold or silence. On the 4th night by lamplight, Russell read aloud from her mother's notebook. Not the technical passages, but the earlier pages, where Cora had written about the river settlement house and the work of plastering, and the winter she had been 19, and the walls had held through the worst freeze the river bottoms had seen since the old settlers had been children. Cal listened from the bench. Ada had fallen asleep against the clay wall, which was warm at her back, the heat seeping out of the material in the steady, patient way Russell had expected. Russell read. The walls gave back in the cold what the fire had given them in the warm days, and that was the whole of it. She closed the notebook. The lamp burned low. Hob shifted at Ada's feet. Outside, the temperature on the 14th day of January 1888 was 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, by the record kept later at the Heron Flat schoolhouse, which had itself been unoccupied through the worst of it, and had lost a window on the north side that filled the room with a drift of snow 6 inches deep across the teacher's desk. 3 households in town had lost all their livestock. 1 man was dead. The frame houses in Heron Flat had held their occupants alive, barely, through the combination of stacked fires and luck and proximity to each other. The lumber-built walls of Heron Flat had done what lumber walls do in that kind of cold, which is to allow heat to leak steadily outward until the fire's work and the cold's work come to a standstill point that is called survivable, because no one in the room has died yet. Survivable is not the same as warm. Russell had warm. On the 3rd day of February, the cold had broken enough that the road north was passable, and Nell took her children home to assess what the barn's failure had left her. She pressed Russell's hand at the door and looked at the walls once more, and said nothing for a moment, which was Nell's way of saying a great deal. 2 days later, on a morning that was cold but ordinary, Russell heard the sound of a horse stopping outside. She set down the mug she was holding and went to the door and opened it. Ambrose Ketterly stood in the snow. He was wearing a good coat and a hat that said he had set out meaning to make an impression, and he was carrying his hat in his hands by the time she opened the door, which said the impression he had arrived to make was not the one he had rehearsed. He was a tall man, and the walk from his horse to her door had been perhaps 20 feet, and she understood from the set of his shoulders that 20 feet had been enough to change whatever it was he had come to say. He looked past her at the interior of the dugout, at the reddish-gray walls, smooth and dry, at Hob, who regarded him from the earthen bench with the permanent mild skepticism of a hound who has seen everyone who matters come to this door and is now assessing whether this one qualifies. Ketterly said not loudly that he had heard Mrs. Sutter's family had come through it here. Russell said they had. He looked at the walls again. His jaw moved slightly, the way a man's jaw moves when he is revising a sentence he had already prepared. He said, "I don't suppose you'd be willing to explain to a man what you did with the walls." Russell looked at him for a moment, not with triumph in it, not with bitterness. She looked at him the way her mother had looked at a wall she was evaluating for its readiness, steadily, without feeling, assessing what was actually there. She said she would get the notebook. She stepped inside and came back with it and held it out. He took it as carefully as a man takes something he has not earned the handling of. She said her mother had worked it out on the Missouri River, and that the principles were not complicated once a person knew what clay did with heat and time. He stood on her threshold holding Cora Dean's notebook, and the light off the February snow fell on its cloth cover and on his hands, which were the hands of a man who had spent 30 years selling things other people made, and Russell watched him read the first page without saying anything more. She had done what needed doing. The cold had decided the question. There was nothing left to argue about. Over the following weeks he came twice more, and by the second visit he had brought a hired man and a set of questions that had converted from dismissal into specific, practical curiosity of the sort that a man like Ketterly arrives at only when something has cost him enough to make him honest. He asked about the ratio of clay to sand. He asked about where on the creek bank the best material was found. He asked about the ventilation cut, and the angle of it, and the reason for the extra inch at the base of the wall. Russell answered everything. She did not make him apologize. She did not refer to the porch, or to what had been said there, or to the phrase that had been going around Heron Flat since November. She answered as she would have answered Nell, in plain language with reference to the notebook, when the notebook said it better than she could. Ketterly's hired man came back a third time without Ketterly, with his own questions, and brought a neighbor whose dugout had let in cold all winter through walls that were bare earth and improperly ventilated. Russell showed that man what to look for at the creek bank, and explained the test for clay plasticity, the way Cora had explained it to her at 9 years old, pressing a ball of material between 2 fingers until it either ribboned or crumbled, and she told him what each result meant and what to do about it. By spring of that year, 3 dugouts south of Heron Flat had clay-lined walls, applied with varying degrees of exactness but recognizable in their approach, and the people in 2 of them had spent the worst of the remaining cold nights in a room that held its heat with a steadiness that the frame houses in town could not match. Word of this particular fact was the kind of word that travels in a settled community without needing a newspaper or a formal occasion to carry it. By the spring of 1889, a woman named Dora Vance, who was homesteading 15 miles north with her husband on a high plain claim, had heard about the clay lining from a cousin who lived east of Heron Flat, and had written Russell a letter asking for the particulars. Russell wrote back with the ratio and the layering method and the ventilation measurement, and told her about the extra inch at the base, and told her where the notebook had come from. Dora Vance applied the method to her own walls in the autumn of 1889, and in the winter of 1890 wrote back to say that the room had held through 3 straight weeks of hard freeze, and she had never been warmer in any house she had lived in, and that she had told her neighbors. The phrase, "the mud woman's burrow," was not used by 1890. The thing had acquired a different name by then, not an official one, nothing that appeared in a county document or a newspaper column, but the kind of regional name that comes from need and repetition. People called it clay lining in the way they said it the first time without the article, as a practice rather than a peculiarity, and in time that name shed the creek south of Heron Flat specificity and became something that belonged to the method itself, which meant it had traveled. Ambrose Ketterly became, over the years, the kind of convert who makes up in thoroughness for the lateness of his arrival. He was not a humble man by nature, but the January of 1888 had done something to the foundations of his self-assurance that could not be entirely repaired, and what filled in the crack was a specific practical respect for Russell Holloway that expressed itself in deference rather than apology. He sent people to her. When strangers came to his store in the late 1880s, and into the 1890s, and said they were planning to build and did not have the money for proper lumber construction. He told them to go 3 miles south on the creek road and speak to the woman there, and that they should ask her specifically about the walls. He said this without irony and without explanation of how he had come to recommend it, and the strangers went, and Russell answered their questions with the same patient plainness she had brought to everything else. She kept the notebook on the same shelf through all the years that followed, between the lamp and the tin of matches, in the place where a thing is put, when it is used regularly and trusted completely. The cover grew soft with handling. The pages her mother had filled remained legible, though the ink in some places had faded to a brown so deep it was almost gold, and reading it in the lamplight of an evening required the kind of attention that was itself a form of honor. There were evenings in the 1890s when Cal Sutter, grown taller than his mother now and working his own claim east of the creek, came with his wife to sit at Russell's table and listen to her talk about the work, the way the young sit with the knowledgeable when they have stopped pretending they already know everything. Russell was past 40 by then, and her hands showed the work they had done, the clay and the cold, and the years of pressing and smoothing and building in the slow, deliberate manner of a person who understood that quick things do not hold. Ada Sutter, who had been the 7-year-old with cold feet against Hobbs' belly in the worst nights of January 1888, grew up to be a woman who clay-lined the walls of every house she ever kept, and who told her own children where the knowledge had come from, and named the woman, and named the notebook, and named the creek bank where the right material was found. The knowledge passed through her hands as it had passed through Russell's, and as it had passed through Cora Dean's before that, neither certified nor copyrighted, belonging to anyone who was patient enough to learn it and honest enough to do the work without cutting the inches at the base of the wall. Nell Sutter outlived Russell by 4 years and was the one who finally wrote down the account of the 11 days in the dugout in a form that passed from hand to hand in Colfax County and was eventually copied by a schoolteacher who thought it worth preserving. That account named Cora Dean as the source and Russell Holloway as the practitioner and described in plain language what the clay walls had held against in January 1888 and what they had held in. It was not a long account. It did not need to be. The dugout itself stood through the 1890s and into the early years of the next century, long past the time when Russell had built a small frame house beside it and used it for storage and for the occasional overnight guest who came too late in the season to make the road back to town safely. The walls never failed. The clay dried fully in the second year, and after that it was simply there, smooth and firm and reddish-gray in the lamplight, holding the heat the way a good wall holds what you give it, returning it when the cold asks for an accounting. On the last evening, Russell kept the dugout as a working shelter before she moved her full household to the frame house. She sat on the old earthen bench and held the notebook in her hands and did not open it. She knew what it said. She had always known. She held it the way you hold a thing from a person who is gone, which is to say you hold the weight of it and the warmth that the holding gives the material, and you let that be enough. Hob lay against the south wall where he had always laid, his muzzle on his crossed paws, his eyes moving between the stove and Russell with the settled contentment of a dog who has spent his life in a warm room and knows it for what it is. The fire burned low. The clay gave back its heat. The wind pressed at the door and found no way through.